vision. Especially when I was younger, a lot of times I would think, editing, that's so boring, the writing is the fun part. But I realized as I became a better writer that what I put out there was really, if I wanted to call it my own, it should be something that I was proud of. And so I saw the point of editing, and I actually got better at it, and I thought it was pretty fun. Because the cool thing about editing is that you have the chance to go back and fix all the mistakes that you made. And you also sometimes have the chance to do more writing, to make your writing more effective, to take stuff out. Occasionally there are some really hard choices that you make when you're editing, so it has a lot of drama. I'm sure that you could probably write a book all about editing, although nobody has really done that yet in fiction. So, Flying Fingers Editing and Revision is our subject. I is here to teach you about writing and editing. Anyone want to point out the errors in that sentence? Can anyone find a few errors? Great, so not saying, we shouldn't say is, it shouldn't be I is here, it should be I am here. Great. Anything else? It should say, yep, I am here. So if somebody walked right up to you and said, I is here, you'd be like, okay, this person needs to know how to use am. No S. Yeah, exactly, the apostrophe S after you is not necessary, and in fact it's incorrect. So I am here to teach you about writing and editing. So I'll give you a hint, there's one more. It could also be I'm here, yep. You could do a contraction instead of I am, you could do I'm, make it a little bit more conversational. Writing and editing does not need a comma. And that's something that I see a lot actually, is people will insert commas just to be like, oh, well, it might need a comma, so let's be safe. That's actually not necessarily the safe thing to do. Inserting commas where you're not totally sure they're needed, you might want to double check first. So, in this case, this is very incorrect. Now, imagine for a moment that I had walked right up to you guys and said, I is here to teach you about writing and editing. You might think, what does she know about writing and editing if this sentence is so incorrect? And that's exactly the same reason why editing and revising is so important for all of us as writers. Not because someone will think, oh, they can't teach me, but rather because they'll think, oh, this writer doesn't have something meaningful to say. Even though we might have something really awesome to say, people will often look at something that has a lot of errors and think, I better think twice about reading this. You can have the best idea in the world, but if you don't bother to edit, polish, and proofread your work, a lot of people will just stop at the first page. Part of that is because it's really difficult to read a work sometimes if it has a lot of errors. And another thing is that they'll question your credibility as a writer. Is this person really worthy to be a writer or for me to read their work? So it's kind of tough. I want you guys to take a look at a really funny picture. This is the toilet restaurant in Taiwan, where all the food is served in toilet-shaped containers. Everyone sits on a toilet seat. This is actually food, by the way. It's not waste product. This is like, I think, a hot pot with corn and broccoli and kind of like a vegetable chili. Anyway, you can see that it's inside a toilet. Raise your hand if you would not eat this. I'm seeing a lot of raised hands. I have to say, I'd probably add myself to this, because even though you know that what's in there is food, you might think, oh, that looks so gross, I couldn't bring myself to eat any of it. And you have to say it looks pretty gross. So from this picture and from the toilet restaurant and our reactions to it, we can learn that presentation is definitely very important. How you put something forward, how it looks, is extremely important. And it's not just food that you need to worry about. Not only should it be good, it should look good and sound good. So just because it was in a toilet container in the toilet restaurant, we were like, it's gross, even though the food itself might have been delicious. And then there's another reason as well, to make sure that the right meaning gets across. This is a really famous example. There's actually a book all about grammar that's called Eats, Shoots, and Leaves. And this is the panda example. So the panda eats, shoots, and leaves. You might think, okay, here's a panda happily chomping on his bamboo versus the panda eats, shoots, and leaves, and suddenly we have a gun involved in sort of a violent restaurant scene taking place. And all because of 2 commas. So you see how when you insert commas, maybe thinking, oh, it's the safe thing to do, I don't know if it needs a comma, but maybe it does, then you could actually even end up drastically changing the meaning of a sentence. And there are lots of examples like this. You want to always make sure that you use your and your correctly, that is Y-O-U-R and Y-O-U apostrophe R-E, because otherwise you could also be saying 2 very different things. That you own something or that you are something. So there's lots of funny examples like the panda eating shoots and leaves versus eating, shooting, and leaving that you can see with just a few commas or an apostrophe can be created. So that's where editing comes in. Now when you think about a definition of editing, it's basically to prepare the final version of a text, so making your final draft by correcting errors and removing unnecessary words or passages. And when you edit, you can also add things if they really help your story along and make it smoother and easier to read. So here's the self-editing checklist. But instead of just reading through this entire thing, I want you to think about the writing that you already have, and we're going to look at a passage that I wrote a few years ago that I think is pretty similar to what you guys have written. So I'm going to type it up, and we're going to ask ourselves, maybe as you see me type it up, what are some errors, but looking beyond the superficial ones. So not just the commas and the apostrophes, but also does it make sense? How could I make it easier to read? How could I make it more interesting? So I'm going to start typing that up really quickly. Okay, so okay, so just from looking at kind of what's been written so far, what do you think off the top of your head are some things that could really be improved quite a bit? So if you look at Joanna and her best friends Harriet and Meg were walking to the park. It was a hot summer day. They were all wearing nice dresses because there was going to be a festival and lots of food and games. Joanna's mother, Mrs. Brown, had cooked chicken and baked chocolate cupcakes and chocolate chip cookies with 3 big pink glitter-covered pieces of white chocolate on top of them, plus a dusting of pink, white, blue sparkly frosting. Mr. Brown also came with them. He was going to do the art contest. Harriet and Meg liked art. Meg had once drawn a pair of shoes on a canvas which had won an award at school. Harriet liked writing better. Joanna's neighbor, Valerie, who is also 10 years old, was coming along. Valerie's baby sister, Nora, was coming along also. So this is actually from a little story that I wrote, I think it was like a couple of years ago, maybe when I was 9, 10, close to your guys' age. So what do you think, just hearing this, what are some immediate things you could think of to improve, to change, to make it better? Okay, so maybe some of the sentences are too long, great. Fix some run-on sentences, use some better vocabulary, there are lots of repeating words, great. I'm seeing all of your word choice thinking coming through here. So I'm going to grab a pen and start circling a few things that could maybe be a little bit better. So, like, let's think about those repeating words, for instance. A lot of stuff isn't indented correctly, exactly. So, like for instance right here, if you'll notice, and that's not like a proofreading mark or anything, you actually have more formal proofreading marks. For now we're just doing a very informal one. But yeah, I've just marked right here where you see that the indent should be over here.
Adora, remember when you turn away
oh yes, sorry.
the microphone so I can hear you.
Okay, so in this example, we have this sentence sticking out here, and it should really be more like over here. It's not indented. And you definitely want to do that because it makes your work more readable and people can understand it better. So another thing is that some sentences don't go together. Perfect. So we have not very varied sentence structure. Some of the words are repeated. So you can see that there's kind of an attempt to be descriptive over here by describing the chocolate cupcakes, but what that does is it sort of takes away from the direction of the story, because what the reader wants when they kind of open up the page is to see, okay, what's happening? Let's get to the conflict really quickly. That doesn't mean that you have to have super dramatic stuff happening on the first page, but it means that you want to make sure that you're not including too much information that kind of directs away from the direction of your story. Wow, direction. I need to practice saying that. Okay, so in other words, if you're taking a path straight that way, you don't want to have kind of a detour. And what's happened over here with the dusting of pink, white, blue, sparkly frosting and the glitter-covered pieces of white chocolate, this part, not all of it is that essential to where the story is going. So maybe it would be better to just say baked sparkly chocolate cupcakes and leave it at that. If you add transitional words, it might make better sense. Perfect. So a lot of times what's happening here is it's kind of just jumping, so you see the two girls walking, and then we see the festival, and it's like, whoa, what happened there with the going from the two girls to the chocolate cupcakes? And here we have Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown also came with them. He was going to the art contest. And we include this information, again, that might not be super relevant. How Meg had once drawn a pair of shoes on a canvas and had won an award at school. Harriet liked writing better. So, to give you guys a quick hint, this is actually a story about two girls getting lost in a cave and they have to find their way out. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not super important that Meg likes to draw or that Harriet likes to write, although those are awesome things. And then in our final paragraph from the passage that I included, we have Joanna's neighbor, Valerie, who is also 10 years old, was coming along. Valerie's baby sister, Nora, was coming along also. And I think that in this paragraph especially, we see a big problem. Anyone know what that problem is? Kind of in the context of the whole passage, this is something a lot of things have in common. Perfect, exactly. You're seeing a lot of the same words being used. Who was also, was coming along, was coming along. So you don't have very much variation, and this was something that was earlier mentioned with word choice, but this is also a sentence structure problem. Because what happens is we have Mr. Brown also came along, and the reader is reading this and thinking, also came along, also came along, also came along, when will it end? And that's not a very pleasant mindset for your reader to be in. So you don't want to make them think, when will this end? And you don't want to create this very this kind of list-like structure, because what this story has turned into, instead of being an interesting description to set the scene, so we can really understand what these two girls are doing, it has really become more of a list. Here's this person that's come along, here's this person that come along, here's what they like, here's what they brought, and it's lost a lot of the suspense. So in order to make this passage better, we can take a look at our editing checklist. I just need to grab my slide advancer. So as we think about self-editing, we can ask ourselves first about structural editing. So structural editing is really the bones of the story, if that's not too creepy for you. It's the foundation, maybe would be a better example. Ask yourself if the order of events or paragraphs makes sense. So if you're saying something that reveals the ending of the story right at the beginning, that might not be such a wise idea, because then the reader would wonder, why am I reading the book? Unless you're doing it for effect to make them think, oh, whoa, what's going to happen next? But generally you want to do beginning, middle, and end in that order. Does each scene tell something important about either the characters or the plot? So when we think about important, sure, you can include information that helps develop character, but there is a limit. So as I mentioned, the example with Harriet liking writing, Valerie liking to draw, might not have been super important right then. Do the characters' actions make sense? If not, can I add or remove a scene in order to create a more logical storyline? So in this case, what they're doing generally makes sense. They're walking to the park, nothing outlandish about that. But if we had them, say, suddenly do jumping jacks in the middle of a pond, it would be like, what? Where did that come from? So be on the lookout. Probably most of you don't have characters doing random things like that. But if it doesn't quite work in the place where you have it, you might want to cut it or move it somewhere else. Does each sentence in the paragraph match the paragraph's main idea? And I know this one you might think is a little bit hard, because a lot of times in fiction we don't start with a main idea that is like, I believe and I want to convince you that something is true. It's a little bit harder to find. But if you think about it, stories have main ideas too. Just think of your conflict. What is the problem in the story? How are you leading up to it? And what are you trying to do with your paragraph? So in this paragraph, the idea is really that Joanna and Harriet and Meg are walking to the park and there's a festival. It's to set the scene. So anything that doesn't quite work here, like for instance the glitter-covered chocolate chip cookies, wow, that's sort of a mouthful actually, and the art contest, that maybe needs cutting out. Alright, going back to the structural editing. So when we think about this, it really comes down to, does it make sense? Does it fit where we have it? And does each sentence really contribute? So you can think of it as a house. Having a lot of extra random beautiful beams of wood lying around, even though they might be lovely beams of wood in a house, will make people trip and will make people have a hard time finding their way around the house. So if you think about your writing like a house, you want to really just have the things that hold up the roof, that give the foundation, and that way people will have a lot smoother time navigating around your house, your writing. Alright, so we thought about the structural issues. Now we can move on to polishing. And ask yourself, do you include descriptive details about how things look, smell, taste, or feel? So, as I mentioned earlier, there's kind of this attempt at being descriptive with the chicken and baked chocolate cupcakes, this description. Okay, let's practice structural editing for a moment. Yep, sure. I'll pause right here. great idea. Okay, here it is. Sorry.
Okay, teachers in the chat room, if your students are looking at a paragraph or sentence or so, and they do a good job revising, you can tag in their revision.
In fact, if the teachers wanted to, they could post it right here on the whiteboard. That way it might be a little easier to see. Oh, okay, that's fine. Well, I can just quickly share sort of a few things that I would notice. Let's see, so for instance, with the, does the order of events and paragraphs make sense? And was there enough description? So in the example, I just started, instead of saying it was a hot day, kind of having this list-like fashion of just listing everything about the day, I changed it into dialogue to try to make it a little more interesting. And then I think I would also kind of take out one of the characters, actually. We introduced the 10-year-old neighbor. I thought, okay, maybe I'll take her out because at this point she's not super useful in the grand scheme of the story. So you can actually do really big things like cutting out a character when you edit, which is fun. Oh great, IR looked at her writing and decided that one chapter was a spoiler for the ending, so she moved and replaced it. Great, that's always a good thing to do for sure, because otherwise, if the reader is smart enough and they're able to figure it out, then they might think, okay, I know what's going to happen, close book. So yeah, great, I'm happy to hear that. And so any other ideas, any other examples of what you did with your writing?
This is Isaac from Mrs. Wilson's class. He made a revision to his writing. He can explain why he felt he needed to make a change. Well, I thought I made need to make a change because some of the characters' actions did make sense when playing back then, and the best way, like some parts it needed, it did make something out, and I would save them for a different part of the story, and it was sort of not illogical.
Okay, great. I'm really glad to hear that. Taking out something that didn't make sense, saying it's not very logical, doesn't help where the story is going. Great. This definitely, like, even just that taking that one action can completely make a big difference because your story just has, gotten way better right then. Perfect. Adding more detail to his piece by using a more specific name for the setting, right? Always a cool thing to do. And one thing is that sometimes, like when I'm first writing a story, I don't come up with a name for a title even, or I don't come up with a name for a setting, but those are definitely things that you'll want to pick up and change when you start self-editing. Great. So more specific information, that's always good. Usually good.
Okay, here's another change that we'll see. I had all this extra things that I didn't really need in my paragraph, and I took them out and just.
Okay, great. Cutting out the extra things in the paragraph. So this is a really important thing to do because, again, if you have this really long introduction that kind of slows down your readers, they're trying to get to the heart of the story, to the conflict and how the characters deal with it, then they might lose patience and give up. And you all have probably read books where the introduction is super long and you read and you read and you read and you're like, okay, I'm bored, I'm tired of this. So you want to make sure that your books don't make the same mistake. And you guys seem to be addressing this issue really well. Great. Any other revisions that you all have made? Anything else?
This is Justin, also from Ms. Wilson's class. I found out that I had to use incorrect commas. They were all over the place. And once I had it time, so I changed it to
Great, yes, being on the lookout for those incorrect commas. Love it. So taking out a few of those incorrect commas and really analyzing, okay, is this needed here? And sometimes we all use punctuation. It might not just be commas, it could be semicolon or period or a dash or something like that. We put them in the wrong place. So always a great way to look at it. And taking out, okay, so Seth took out a detail that didn't make sense where it was and moved it later into the story. Perfect. A lot of times we sometimes I've noticed that we can be very top heavy. That is, we introduce a lot of characters right in the first paragraph. We're like, here's Nora, and here's Valerie, and here's Harriet, and here's Meg. But the problem is that what happens is that the reader is going to be like, whoa, 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 I can't remember all these names. This is a lot of characters. And especially for us, since we're probably writing stories that aren't too much longer than 50 pages, I'm assuming, then having a lot of characters may not necessarily make all that much sense. So when you're writing a story that's more of a novella, under 50 pages, or a short story, more like under 10 pages, then you want to make sure that the number of characters you have is not too many. Right? Reworking events so they make sense, adding details, moving sentences into a different order. Perfect. So, as we think about structural editing, it's essentially one big question. Is this easy to read, and do I provide enough detail without becoming uninteresting? So you want to always make sure that you have enough suspense, enough interest, that you create realistic characters right here in the beginning, because the beginning is really where the important stuff is, because it's when the reader kind of decides, am I going to read this, or will I put the book down? Alright, so moving on. Here we have our passage. So with this Mr. Brown, Mrs. Brown, this whole thing, what might end up happening is, oh, that's strange, it hasn't synchronized over here. Okay. Well, in the case of this story passage, we might end up thinking, okay, let's cut out one or two of the characters that doesn't make sense. Maybe we can cut out the art bit as well, make the cupcake bit a little bit shorter, and yes, let me fix that 1 second. Okay, I think that solved the problem. Great. Alright, so I think instead of maybe just saying they're walking in the park, we can create a little dialogue. And what that does is that we can kind of develop their character without having to do this big description. Like Meg often says things in a sarcastic voice, or often uses hyperbole. Hyperbole is when you're saying something in this really exaggerated way, so you don't really mean that your arms are melting off. Like Meg says here, I feel like my arms are melting off, but she says that. So what having a little bit of dialogue does, as we talked about yesterday, can create character. So that way, when we include this little bit of dialogue with Meg, it kind of shows that she can exaggerate a little bit sometimes. And we can take out maybe this bit about the art contest if that was the goal there to create character. I'm also going to say that we don't need Mr. Brown, and we don't need Valerie, and we don't need Nora. Now I know that's a little bit extreme to get rid of 3 characters entirely, but these are the kinds of decisions that you can make, and that you totally have the right to make when you think, okay, do they make sense, do they contribute? Because in the ultimate scheme of things, I want them to get to these caves where they get lost as fast as possible, while still providing enough background about them so that the story is furthered.
Thank you. Carmito has a nice comment next to writing dialogue. Carmito?
I'm sorry, that I wasn't able to hear that very well. It was really soft, Mrs. Benson. Could you please repeat or put it in the chat?
I'm going to repeat Carlos's comment. Carlito's comment. He was looking at his dialogue and realized that he used the word said quite frequently, and he's going to change and use a better word choice. He's going to use exclaimed, shouted, whispered, and different synonyms for said to jazz up his story.
Perfect. This is actually a really awesome comment because a lot of times we think about word choice and we look at the other words, but we don't focus in on one of the words that gets repeated the most, which is, as Carlito said. You know, we say I said and she said and he said, and it gets really boring after a while. And if you ever have tried to say said over and over again, you will get so sick of it. Yet that's what we do in our writing. So actually, if we can quickly just kind of make use of this comment, let's think of a bunch of alternative words for said so that you can't, so there's no excuse really for not saying or for saying said. Okay, so I'm going to start writing here. Give me one moment. Shouted, that's perfect. Great, what else? So I can think of at least 2 or 3, I think. Muttered. And excuse me if the handwriting isn't so good, it might be on a bit of a delay. Great, explained, spoke, whined, screeched, cried. And as you think about these words, also think about, are they negative, are they positive, are they neutral? So for instance, if you say told, spoke, these are fairly neutral. They're not saying, okay, this is, bad, this is good. Weeped, hollered, growled, wow, you guys are really creative. Whispered, uttered. Also, when I write on here, will it mess up what you're writing? Because I'm a little bit worried. Okay, good. We can write it sometime. Whispered, yelled, scolded. I'm surprised to see nobody has said bellowed yet. Bellowed is pretty awesome. Okay. Screamed. Exclaimed. Inside we have, especially if you're really not happy with something, grunted, uttered, blasted. Oh wow, my hand's getting tired. Boomed, intoned. That is honestly one of my favorite words, intoned, right there. Because intoned is so awesome. I mean, like, intoned, it just makes you think of this super formal, intense situation where you're like standing in front of a high overlord who starts intoning. I don't know. So you can see how with just a single word like intoned, this awesome image can come to mind. And isn't that so much better than he said, he intoned, or he muttered, he explained, whined, screeched, cried, yelled, scolded, screamed, uttered, blasted, reprimanded. All these words create such vivid images in the reader's mind, and even better, they allow us to really hear what the person's saying. So, in your writer's notebooks, you can start writing down some of your favorites. Don't worry, I'm not going to expect you to write down all of these, but just make a quick column, which is, let's see if I have space. I'm going to quickly make a new page, but I'll go back to this one. I'm not deleting anything. So, just write good, neutral, and bad. And then write a few words underneath them. So for instance, screech. Screech would be really when I say bad, obviously it's not a bad word, but screech would not be, someone who's screeching would probably not be happy. Same thing with hiss. Like if you hiss at someone, she hissed at him angrily. It would probably not be good. Told, spoke, these ones are neutral. And then for good, we could have, let's see, what would be good? I'm going to go back to the page that we had. We have a lot of Exclaimed is good, yes, definitely. Exclaimed would probably be excited and happy, usually. It could also be surprised, but that in and of itself is not like bad. Okay, great. Exclaimed and maybe yipped. This is more like a dog, but definitely people could yip or get really excited about something. I guess that could be bad too. So we have basically our little 3 columns, and just write down your favorite ones. So I have exclaimed and yipped, told and spoke, screech and hissed. And that way, anytime you're in need of a word, you can just look at your column and replace one of these, use one of these instead of said. So here's your list of words. I'll give you a minute to finish that up. Oh, cheered. That's a really good one too. For good. Okay, great. I'm hoping that you guys have some pretty nice columns going. So, oh, divulge. This one's awesome. Okay, so I'm going to put divulge under neutral, but the awesome thing about a word like divulge is that it kind of carries an additional meaning. So you wouldn't use divulge and just like to replace any old said. So you couldn't just be like, hi, what's up, she divulged. That wouldn't quite work. If you divulge something, it's kind of like revealing information that would before be sort of secret. So the spy divulged in a whispered voice would be like more appropriate. So you can have all these awesome words, and the great thing is that some of them also carry additional meaning. So if you explain something, of course, it would usually be in response to a question. And if you're questioning something, then it would be asking a question. That's fairly self-explanatory. Oh yes, do we need any more time? Great, thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, this is actually a really fun thing to do, and it's very useful because if you just keep this chart by you, then anytime you're about to use said, you could always substitute something in. Now, said is not like an evil word. If occasionally you're like, okay, I've kind of gone through a lot of my replacement words, and maybe they just said something like they said it, then you can use it. But generally, the problem is that we will use it 1,000 times, and we won't really notice. So, next time you're about to write said, just think of this. Okay, so back to the presentation, and we know that we can do structural editing, but there's also something really cool, which is polishing. And oh, I need to start the application sharing one more time, sorry. And the awesome thing about polishing is that it gives you the chance to really write some more if you are lacking in anything. And you can also ask yourself more detailed questions, like, is the dialogue realistic? And that's something that we can hopefully address with what we just did, our activity with the good, bad, and neutral words. And that way we can make things more realistic, so that if we're saying, what are you doing, he said, instead of he said, we could use a more effective word, like, what are you doing, he bellowed, and that would really get across the anger and the intensity a lot more. So that helps with the dialogue being realistic. Does my dialogue help tell the story, or is it just filler? You probably have a red flag, a sort of warning note, if you have a paragraph-long dialogue about what fabric of dress to choose and it's not a story about picking dresses. And that was actually one of my big weaknesses. I'll admit that sometimes I would have really long descriptive paragraphs about what people were wearing because I loved color and fabric so much that I would sort of forget that I had a story to tell. So that's a good question to ask about dialogue, and it's also a good question to ask about description. Sometimes it is actually possible to have too much description. You start saying her dress had 14 buttons and each button was 1 inch large, then it would be like, okay, that's really not super necessary unless your story is about buttons. Are any of my scenes or paragraphs or chapters too long and boring? What can I remove to make the story more interesting and suspenseful? Can I add any words to a sentence to make it easier to read? So these are all things that can really help you make your story more polished and complete overall. These are not errors per se. If you say, there was a chair in the room and you're not being super descriptive, that won't kill your story. But by polishing it up to include more detail, to paint a more vivid picture, to use realistic dialogue, are things that will make your story a lot more interesting to read. So then we move on to proofreading, and this is like the actual errors that really stand out generally. Asking yourself, spelling correctly, do all the sentences begin with capital letters, and here are a few things that sometimes can get forgotten. Well, the punctuation at the end of each sentence, I'm guessing most of you don't have too much of a problem with, always including a period after your sentence. But here's one that we might need to watch out for. Do I indent each time a person talks? This is important because a lot of times what will happen is we'll just write dialogue right after one another. You know what I mean. If we do something like, here I'm going to move over here for a second. If we do something like this, hello, he said, hi, she said, that's a nice sweater, he said. Okay, well, not only do we know now what we can change, we could change he exclaimed jubilantly. So this suddenly changes the hello. Instead of just being a normal hello, it could be hello, like really happy to see whoever this is. Okay, hi, she said. So we can change this. Hi, she responded nonchalantly. So she's not quite, so she's just kind of like, oh, what's up? So the ultimate thing here, though, is not necessarily the words, but the fact that we don't have indents. So what we want to do is hello, he exclaimed jubilantly. Hi, she responded nonchalantly. That's a nice sweater, he said, pointing at Anna's Christmas sweater or something. Maybe it's like horses and reindeer on it or something. Okay, so we have, now you see how we have indents. And the reason that we do indents is because we want to make sure that everyone can read this easily. And what happens when we go back like this or this, it's very hard to tell who's talking. Even if we have the he said, she said, it can be difficult to tell who's talking. So we want to make sure that we indent in order for our message to get across. All right, moving on. Are there quotation marks around my dialogue? Also, sometimes it's easy to forget when you're writing about people talking and it's really fast that you do need those quotation marks. So super important again, so we can tell what's the narration and what's what people are saying. So the difference between dialogue and narration can be shown with quotation marks. Do I have any comma splices? Anyone know what a comma splice is? Can anyone explain what a comma splice is? Or just take a guess from what it sounds like.
Our fifth graders have not learned about comma splices, so maybe you could explain what that is and give us an example.
Sure, I wasn't expecting that too many people would probably know what a comma splice is because I only learned it like, I don't know, when I was 13, yeah, so it's definitely more of a kind of complicated grammar thing to learn about, but a comma splice is basically, it's fairly noticeable. We all do it quite a lot actually without really noticing. A comma splice is where you incorrectly use a comma to connect two things that should be separate sentences. So for instance, if you say something like, I went to the park, comma, let me think. The two dogs ran up to me, comma, my mom says I should eat more cake, comma, the chair was nice to sit in. That's actually a bunch of comma splices. Whenever you use a comma to connect something where there should really be a period in between them or a semicolon, then that would be a comma splice. So just, you don't necessarily have to remember that term, but just be on the lookout for where you have run-on sentences, which is actually the next thing on the list. Are my tenses correct? Okay, anyone know about tenses? What are the tenses? Great, Mrs. Posey's class has it. When something is happening past, present, or future. So past tense would be I said, they said. In present tense, it would be I say, they say. And future tense would be they will say, which is a little weird. We don't tend to use future tense quite as much, but future tense can be good if you're wanting to build suspense. If any of you have heard the kind of cliche or the very repeated phrase, little did they know, that's not quite a use of future. It's kind of coming from the future, talking about people in the past, which is a really weird way to think. But if you're writing, you need to decide right from the beginning, am I going to be writing in present tense, or am I going to be writing in past tense, am I going to be writing in future tense? I will warn you, writing in future tense can be a really big pain sometimes if you have to check all the they will say, they will have said. Like, that's crazy when you do like the future past stuff. Even that can confuse even me, and I've been occasionally writing in future tense. So generally, most of you will probably be doing present or past. Past is pretty fun. Past is said, went, things like that. However, if you want to create a lot of in the action kind of dialogue and really make the reader feel like you're right in the middle of something, you might want to use present. The ultimate thing to make sure of, whether you're using present, past, future, is that your tenses match. So you can't be like, the girl says, followed by, he said a long time ago. That wouldn't quite mesh correctly. And a lot of times what will happen is sometimes you'll do this without quite noticing. So you'll be like, I say, then I went to the store, which, or actually that's not a great example. Maybe, here, let me open up the whiteboard and have a new page. And why don't we try to make some tenses match? Okay, so in the afternoon, are you seeing what I'm writing right now? Okay, so there's actually a couple problems with this. It's not just that the tenses don't match here, it's also that maybe having this girl jump on a squirrel right as they're walking to the grocery store might not make a whole lot of sense. Unless this is a magic squirrel, and that's part of where the story is going, which it totally could be. But let's look at this. In the afternoon, we went to the store. It was a beautiful day with blue skies and warm weather, though the sticky, humid air clung to my skin and made me sweat. Eek, I say as I jump on a squirrel. So, does anyone want to point out where the tenses don't match? What is the exact spot where the tenses shift?
At the beginning it says we went to the store, but then later it says I say
Great. Great, this is exactly what we need to do. Instead of I say as I jump on a squirrel, in order to make it match with we went, it was, clung, made, these are all past tense. So in order to make this match with all that, we would want to change that to said and jumped. Perfect. So I'm going to change that over here. Oh, I guess it's just on this computer. Okay. Said. And I'll just add the ed right here. Okay, so that's basically past, present, future tense. Future tense, yeah, as I said, can be a little bit tricky sometimes, so I'm not going to include an example here in the hopes that most of you guys are writing with past and present, just because it can be a little bit easier. But I'm going to go back to the application share. I definitely encourage you all to experiment with the tenses, write in different ones for practice to see which ones you like, and then when you're writing your whole story, just see which one am I using more, if you kind of switch between them a lot, which one is more appropriate for the course of the story, and then make your changes accordingly. Alright, also ask yourself, do I include paragraph breaks? So does anyone kind of know the importance of why we want to include paragraph breaks at all? Anyone want to share? What do you think? Why do we have these?
That it's not a long round paragraph, and so it's not boring, and it's not short.
Great, exactly, so that it doesn't get confusing, so that it doesn't run on and get boring. Another thing is that when you see a really big, blocky piece of text, like that fills up an entire page, sometimes you can get a little bit scared as a reader and think, I wonder if I want to read this, it looks so scary, even though it really might not be. So anytime that it makes logical sense to do so, you'll want to include paragraph breaks to really indicate, okay, whereas, as Ms. Posey's class is saying, you can help switch scenes in the story, and that way you don't have, they went to the park, followed by, they went to the zoo, they got stuck in the caves, in one big paragraph, which would be very confusing. You can have one paragraph, here's them at the park, here's what they're doing at the park. Next paragraph, they begin walking to the zoo. Paragraph after that, they slip into the dark, rainy, water-covered cave or something like that. Great. So if you have this scene switching going on, then paragraph breaks can really help with that. Also, as we mentioned earlier, when you have dialogue starting, you would want to make a new line and indent to show where that dialogue is beginning, just like they do in chapter books. So, as you're proofreading, really the general goal is to make sure that everything is correct, and beyond correct, that it's very clear for the reader. Things like paragraph breaks aren't mandatory, but they really, really help. Things like punctuation at the end of each sentence and spelling your words correctly is definitely pretty mandatory. Alright, so we can quickly review now what we've learned. So we have details about, I need to sync up the stuff on the board with one here. Okay, here we go. So we know about polishing and structural. Okay, so here's our structural editing. Order of paragraphs. Does everything make sense? Match the main idea. Further the story along. Take us further on that path. And the right path, okay, so there's our story path to be edited. Polishing. You want to really make sure that your story is as complete and as beautiful as it can be, including descriptive details about how things look, smell, taste, or feel. Make sure that you're describing with a purpose so that you're not just throwing in, okay, this dress had 14 buttons, as I mentioned in the example, but rather you're including description that paints a picture of the setting or that helps tell details about a character that really has purpose. You may not want to describe every single piece of dust in the room, but you would definitely want to quickly describe the room if it's important in the story, if they're going to spend a long time there. And try to describe that at the beginning as opposed to the end. Does my dialogue sound realistic? This is super important because it again helps develop your character. if that evil hamster had said, the evil hamster we worked with yesterday had said something like, "My beautiful, benevolent, kind masters have fed me all this beautiful food. Thank you." This would have been completely unrealistic for his character, not to mention who speaks like that, unless that's their character. Are any of my scenes or paragraphs or chapters too long and boring? If you give your story to a friend to read and they're like, "Well, I fell asleep in the middle of the second chapter," then that might be a warning sign. And you would want to use the paragraph when the setting changes. Okay, just saw that. Great. Can I add any words to a sentence to make it easier to read? Overall, the goal of polishing, just like polishing a stone or a rock, is to produce a very smooth outside and smooth inside of your story. Proofreading. This is really some fun stuff. The great thing about proofreading is that some of these errors are fairly easy to catch. If you're using a comma or a period incorrectly, or you're capitalizing things when they don't need to be, or you're not capitalizing, most of the time you can pick that out fairly easily just looking at your writing. And if you can't, but you know that you have some errors, you can always ask your teacher, ask your parents, or ask a friend to look at it for you. Getting editing from your friends, getting editing from your classmates is a great way to catch each other's errors. In fact, you can ask your classmates and teachers about any of these questions. It's always great to get a second look, even after you've self-edited and you've produced this really nice new draft. It's always good to have someone else look at it. So that's really basically editing and revision. To go back to the picture that I know that we all love of the maybe badly presented food at the toilet restaurant in Taiwan, when we think about editing, the goal is to get this lovely food out of the toilet and into a beautiful bowl so that people will be really willing to eat it and not all, "Oh, I'm scared, it looks gross." So presentation is important, and if you kind of walk away with one thing, it's also that writing is really the mark that we make on the world. Even in like 40 years, it's really cool to think that maybe somebody could open up a book and see your name on it or your writing in it. And so if we think about writing this way, we really need to make sure that our mark is something we can be proud of. So is there time for like one or two questions? Is really running through the story, making sure that you don't lose track a lot. So for instance, if there's this really urgent quest to find this medicine for the princess, I swear that has been in like 1,000 stories, but let's say that's your conflict, which is an absolutely fine one, then you would want to make sure that you don't have a whole chapter about this mouse that lives in the dungeon and likes eating cheese. Because funny or interesting as that might be, it doesn't connect to the conflict. So just ask yourself, does this connect back to the conflict, or does it tell the reader something about a character that is important? And that should help keep them interested and connected. Another technique, this one's a little bit fun to do, is to end on a cliffhanger at chapter endings, and that can be a little bit fun because I don't know what to keep reading. And one more question? I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear that. Could you speak up a little louder?
How do you know when you have a run-on sentence?
How do you know when you have a run-on sentence? Great question. Well, actually there's a lot of resources online for grammar. I should mention this really quickly. If you want to know more about things like comma splices, run-on sentences, you can look them up. There's like a really good website at the Purdue University dedicated entirely to grammar. So for run-on sentences, you can tell when you have a run-on sentence, not just, the interesting thing about a run-on sentence is that it might not necessarily be long, but it just it connects things that don't need to be connected, or that, I should say, shouldn't be connected. Oops. So, for instance, if we have, let's say, people going to the park. Sorry, spring has finally sprung here in Washington State, so I can't stop thinking about going to the parks. Okay, so we have, oops, don't know what's happening over there. Right, so I walked to the park with my friends. My friends are really cool. We got ice cream at the concession stand. This was an amazing day. I think this is pretty awesome, don't you? Okay, no, it's not really awesome, because what happens is, well, here's a bunch of comma splices like that. But I walk to the park with my friends. My friends are really cool. These things deserve to be their own sentences. So that's when you know you have a run-on, is if something that could be its own sentence, I think, is connected and it shouldn't be connected, because you can only really have like one of these, or you can do, I walk to the park with my friends, semicolon, my friends are really cool. I will admit I am quite an overuser of these semicolons. I think you want to use semicolons more if the subject is connected. So my friends, this is okay. Oh, and here's, yeah. Okay, so that's an example of a run-on sentence for you. And let's see, I'll do one more question from Mrs. Posey's class. How do you switch points of view successfully to hear from more than one character in a story? Wow, you are taking on this really cool challenge actually, because I haven't done that too often. I've done it occasionally. What I've seen that has worked in a lot of stories, I think I tried this 1 or 2 times, is you might have something like chapter 1 and then chapter 2, so you could have, let me make this a little bigger. Oops. Okay, so in this example, we could have chapter 1, Kira, and then, have Kira is what she's thinking, and then we could have it switch off to be chapter 2, Jonathan, and chapter 3, Michael, or whoever your characters are. And that way you can cut down on the confusion if you have the chapters switch. However, if they're only thinking, say if you have 2 sentences from Kira's point of view and you have 2 sentences from Jonathan's point of view, then you might want to think about, okay, how can I tell this story with maybe fewer characters, or how can I tell this story without having to break up chapters? So one way to do that can be paragraph breaks. But that's definitely doable, and it's really cool when you do manage to do that. Okay, well, thank you so very much, everyone. I really appreciated all of your great questions, and I hope that you gained a lot from editing and revising. So you should have your nice good, neutral, and bad word list to take away from you, and I hope that'll be really helpful. Oh yeah, Mrs. Benson?
What would you like to say to Adora?
Thank you so much, guys. It's been amazing working with all of you. You're so enthusiastic. I really appreciate how much you've been working on your writing, and I know that it will improve amazingly when you put yourself into how you can edit it and really think about, wow, this is the mark that I'm having on the world. And I know that in a few years you'll look back and you'll be like, wow, there's a lot of things that have changed, because that's sort of what you do as you get older. I look back at my own work and I think that all the time. But the hope is that by editing this now, that we can really make ourselves a lot prouder of our work in the future. Kind of interesting to think about. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I hope you have a lot of fun with your writing, with your editing and revising. And make sure to tell other people lots of stories about your own stories and get their feedback. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.